Hey everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of the Indie Studies podcast. I'm your host, Haz, and I hope you're all having a beautiful, wonderful day out there today. This whole podcast started with a pretty simple question. I wanted to figure out what it means to be indie today. Because just like with anything else in life, definitions and connotations in art change as society and cultures do around them. The life of an indie songwriter, musician, painter, or author looked incredibly different 40 years ago than it does now. Hell, it looked pretty different 10 years ago. So our goal here is to learn what indie means across all those different mediums. We're gonna explore the history of the indie movements around them, talk with some indie artists on the way, and discover together why supporting and consuming all forms of independent art is so incredibly important, arguably now more than ever. And we are gonna get to all those different mediums eventually, but realistically, we do just have to start somewhere. For us, that somewhere is gonna be music. If I'm being honest, that question that sparked this whole show, what it means to be indie today, really traces back to me being in middle and high school. Back to when I was really, for the first time, exploring my own music taste. It's when I started separating from the top 40 and hit country radio, or classic rock CDs that my parents would be playing in the car when I was growing up. Don't get me wrong, I loved those. The first real concert I ever went to was an Eagles farewell tour. But as I found my own taste, I kept noticing this label come up across different artists that I enjoyed. A lot of them were being called indie. Now, this was the 2010s, so the indie music scene was pretty well established by this point. There were plenty of artists making headway and being commercially successful without the backing or support of one of the major labels. For reference, SoundCloud had just launched in late 2008, and then just a few years later, in 2011, Spotify launched here in the US. The age of streaming music had just begun, and small artists now had a way to share their music with the world without having to invest into printing CDs, pressing vinyl, or recording onto cassettes. Arguably, for the first time, all an artist had to do was learn how to mix and master their recordings, and they now had immediate access to a global audience of potential listeners. And don't get me wrong, that is still an insanely difficult task, but that possibility of reaching a worldwide audience was now seemingly available to everyone. And this might be a hot take, but I think music was great because of this. Creativity and storytelling flourished because of this. And I know I am so incredibly grateful for this burst in content and change in creativity because it helped me fall in love, not just with music, but so many other different art forms that saw similar bursts as well. And we will get to the real impact that streaming music and the internet as a whole had on indie movements down the road. But the first thing we need to do is to define what being indie means in the music scene. Try to figure out where it started. See how the meaning of that indie label has changed and evolved over time. And hopefully find out what it means today. And that's broadly what we're going to be doing today, which I know sounds like a pretty daunting task for a half-hour show, so I guess we better get started. One of the reasons I wanted to start this series, talking about music specifically, is because the term indie is so complex in certain ways within the music scene. It's both a genre of music and a status condition for an artist in a way that I don't think you really see in other mediums. What I mean is that there's the indie genre and subgenres that all have their own unique and distinctive styles and tone. And then, separate from that, there are independent artists across every genre. Artists and groups who don't have the backing of a label. They don't have professional sound engineers mixing tracks, or promotion teams helping them advertise shows and releases. They're indie not necessarily in their tone, but in their approach to making music. And this twin use of the term was something I found really interesting in music. And if our goal is to define what being indie means, I think diving in and understanding both of those uses is really the best place for us to start. So, independence in music has always existed, but the creation of the modern indie scene in music dates back to the 1970s, particularly January of 1977, when the Buzzcocks, a punk band from the UK, released their EP Spiral Scratch. The story goes that they borrowed £500 from friends and family members to pay for that initial 1,000-copy pressing. They even had to set up their own label, which they called New Hormones, just to do this. They only hoped that they could sell enough to pay back the money that they borrowed. Spiral Scratch took off. It sold more than 15,000 copies in its initial run. Later re-releases ended up finding chart success. These 4 guys from Manchester changed not only their world, but the music world, with 4 songs, which totaled just over 10 minutes of playtime. This was the first time a band had done everything themselves and been successful, from writing to recording to physically going to record stores themselves, representing the album, working to put it up on shelves. And if you listen to it, I think you can still see why this record took off. It has such a unique feel to it. It feels raw, imperfect, and most importantly, intimate. For comparison, 1977 also saw the release of Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, a perfect example of an album made and produced by the major dealers in the music industry. Everything on Rumors sounds so perfect and clean. It's clear that it is a collection of the best possible work done by everyone involved. Not just the band members, but the producers and sound engineers working with them in the room, changing setups between songs to make sure that each instrument was recorded the correct way to sound exactly as they wanted it to once the needle dropped on the record. And then jump back to Spiral Scratch. As you listen to it, it sounds like you're there in the room with them as they're playing it. It's more reminiscent of being at a concert than a finished, polished record of that era for any genre. And if you think that it is just genre-specific differences, I wouldn't blame you. 70s English punk, mainstream soft, or pop rock have a lot of those genre differences. But I would tell you to go listen to Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. Again, this album was also released in 1977, but more important than that, the Sex Pistols were a band who not only influenced the Buzzcocks, but gave the Buzzcocks a start, having them as an opening act at a Manchester show. Nevermind the Bollocks sounds so clean and perfected. It's what's considered to be a high-fidelity recording, a quality standard far more in tune with Fleetwood Mac than the low-fidelity young upstarts. I bring this up because the tone the Buzzcocks captured on this EP has come to be one of the defining features of indie-style music. Indie as a genre term is defined by songs that feel raw and unpolished, that even though it was recorded far away from you, and sometimes decades in the past, feels and sounds like you were there in the room with the artist as it plays through your speakers. Virtually everything that indie is as a genre, and the features that differentiate the indie subgenres from the rest of their tree are present across those 4 songs. It is a gritty and unpolished sound in the best possible way. It is raw and shy, a far cry from the grandiose, perfected music that graced the airwaves and topped the charts of the day. And I really do mean that it sounds shy. Not like it's just too quiet and not mixed properly. You could just turn up the volume and that wouldn't really be a problem. Shy as if the band were reserved while recording it, like they were afraid of being caught for doing something wrong by making music this way. Fleetwood Mac are so confident in their sound. They know what they're doing when they're making an album. I mean, there's a reason that anyone who really likes 70s music has Rumors in their collection, or at the very least, a few songs downloaded to their playlists. It commands your attention, like any quote-unquote perfected art does. If we were to compare it to visual arts, Rumors is an exhibition in an art museum, a collection of work by great artists who worked worked incredibly hard to make something, and now their artwork is being displayed for the masses due to reach and backing by institutions. Spiral Scratch and indie music as a whole are much more like graffiti, still beautiful pieces of art and made with love and dedication, but pieces that don't have the reach or backing of any institution. Spiral Scratch was never guaranteed to reach a large number of people, but the Buzzcocks still made this album because they felt called to put their work out there, hoping it would be appreciated, but in no way expecting it to find a large audience. What I think is special about this album is that it's both the start for the indie genre, like we've discussed, and the status of being an independent musician. Like I said, the Buzzcocks were the first band to do everything themselves and be successful at it. They made their own label because no professional label were scouting in Manchester at the time. In addition to that indie tone starting here, the DIY music attitude started here too. The Buzzcocks had shown us that you could be successful by making things yourself. But as we know, a separation between the indie style and genre and the indie ethos or methodology of making music came at some point. I also want to say that the indie genre going mainstream, or at least becoming a relatively known genre of music, wasn't the cause of this. Indie music being popular only helps support and promote smaller, independent artists who are financing their work themselves. I think the world fell in love with the indie genre and subgenres for the very reason I've already mentioned. When you hear it, it feels like you're part of the experience. And as the Buzzcocks had their success, more and more bands wanted to follow them, which then inspired more and more bands after them. This led to a huge burst in bands making similar music, finally creating the indie genre by the mid-80s. Labels had begun recreating that low-fidelity, raw, intimate sound because we all love it. And over time, it became an overarching style rather than a signal that an artist was producing this music by themselves. Certainly, by the 1990s, this split had been cemented. Independent artists still made and sold music themselves, and some certainly found success. Other times, the only truly independent things a band produced were demo tapes or a first EP to sell at early gigs. Labels had begun popping up, first in the UK and US, then across the world. Labels who were calling themselves indie. They incorporated this sound and style into what they helped create, and supported artists who were not being seen or whose music was unsupported and unwanted by major recording companies. They became a center for creative expression, helping more and more artists find their way, create incredible music, and help show the world that there were more incredible artists out there than just the ones we heard on the radio. The 1990s really showed this, with bands like Nirvana releasing albums on small record labels. In Nirvana's case, this was Sub Pop, who still to this day have an insanely impressive track record of launching the careers of unknown artists into mainstream success. This happened everywhere too. R.E.M. had a very similar track to Nirvana starting just a few years prior. They found some early success on IRS, an indie label, before being signed to Warner Brothers. There were small labels all over the world launching the careers of small artists looking to make a name for themselves. These indie record labels became a sort of minor league or development league for artists, showing them how making albums and the music industry as a whole works when you have support from a label. Indie record labels helped support these young new artists and continued to create music that laid the footing for what the indie genre would become. This style is still going strong today. Perhaps it's even stronger than ever. Over time, the indie genre has grown and evolved. It has sparked new areas of exploration and creativity, leading to rises in different categories of music. I think it's also important to mention that for most of its history, the indie genre has been very closely tied to the rock genre as a whole. We have also kind of continuously chosen one general subgenre and given it the overarching indie title. This usually lasts for 10 to 15 years, and then we find a new subgenre that either evolved out of that specific scene in music or give that overarching indie label to a different area of music that better fits the style of that time. There are areas of every genre that fit both the indie styling and that DIY mentality. Until recently, when someone says, I listen to indie music, we would almost immediately jump to rock. I think what we consider to be the indie genre today, what gets that overarching indie shorthand, is probably more connected to the folk or country stylings of music than the general rock nomenclature. Currently, the indie genre is almost totally synonymous with the singer-songwriters of the world. I think where the indie genre has really found its success is in being a subgenre, being a place for fans who want to support smaller artists, fans who find their way there because someone showed them the door and welcomed them in. It's become a place for people who don't find connection with the glitz, glam, and mass marketing of pop music, for fans who want to feel connected to their favorite artists and see a star who connects with them as a real person, not just some idol held out to them from afar. And the indie subgenres have had success doing this across very different areas of music for nearly the last 50 years. Over this time, the indie genre, that overarching title, has gone through the punk and post-punk scenes of the late 70s and 80s. It carried into the grunge scene of the 90s, and then the alt scene of the late 90s and early 2000s. In the 2010s, when I first started discovering it, it was alt-rock and grunge bands from the 90s and 2000s that really caught my attention. But there were also contemporary folkier and more acoustic bands that absolutely fit this indie genre styling. Indie music as a whole has kind of always been about storytelling and speaking one's mind. And since the 2010s, as recording has become easier and more accessible to the masses, and also as the internet has connected the world in new ways, those raw, intimate, deep stories shared through indie music have really taken off, which leads us to the singer-songwriters carrying this indie label today. Across all of these genres, and through all of these different times, bands have found success. They have been popular, growing, and changing with tastes and wants, and labels of varying sizes have supported them in defining what the indie genre is, and which subgenre we name the defining indie genre of that time will change again, just as it periodically has for the last 50 years. I don't know what it will be next. Whatever it is, I know it will be defined by music that is raw, unpolished, intimate, and shy in the best possible way, because that's what indie music always has been. Then there are the completely independent artists. Their music often still fits into the indie genre, this raw, shy, intimate feeling that we've all fallen in love with, but they don't have any ties or support to a label. Any reach their music has is their own doing, and should it ever find its way onto the radio, it's because the band themselves got it there. And I'm not really sure why, but there does seem to be more of them today than ever. Perhaps this is because of tools like social media, which allow us to see and connect with these artists earlier and earlier in their careers and follow their stories. Maybe it's because the streaming method of listening to music has changed the way we're exposed to new, small artists. We're no longer taking a chance on buying that random 45 in the new release section of a record store just because the cover piqued our interest, or waiting for that one friend we all have who is somehow insanely in touch with the overall music scene to finish recording their latest mixtape and pass it off for us to try. Today, these artists come up across our TikTok pages, Instagram feeds, or maybe that same friend puts someone new on a playlist that you've liked and saved in the past. No matter how we find them, one thing is always the same. They are working tirelessly to make their music and share it with the world, and searching for fans anywhere they can find them. These artists, the ones still following the DIY method the Buzzcocks showed the world can work back in 1977, these bands who are being their own publicists, producers, recording engineers, these artists writing and performing every instrument and line themselves, these musicians working to make a name for themselves are the independent artists we are going to be exploring here on Indie Studies. The way they create their music and how they share it with the world is what we're going to be talking about. So, we've found where the indie movement started in music. We've seen how it has grown and changed and become a term that really has multiple meanings in the music world. We saw how indie labels began popping up, supporting small artists and launching their careers, and how that overarching indie genre title has been associated with different scenes over the last 50 years. We've also realized that for this podcast, when we say indie artists, we mean people who are following that do-it-yourself mentality because they feel moved or called to create, hoping that their music finds an audience and never giving up on that dream. As time has moved on and technology has changed from the late 70s, so too have the ways that indie artists share their music with the world. Next time on the Indie Studies podcast, we're going to take a look at the impact different ways of sharing and listening to music has had on the indie movement. If supporting independent art is important to you, share this episode with your friends. Also, check out other shows from the Indie Bubble. Search for Indie Bubble wherever you get your podcasts and explore our other shows. Follow both the Indie Studies podcast and Indie Bubble on socials. Check out the show notes for links to our pages. And if you want to find out more information about the beginnings of the indie movement in music, or learn more about what we talked about in this episode, also check out the show notes for links to all the sources we used when making this episode. And most importantly, thank you for listening, and see you next time on Indie Studies.